Welcome to What If Sleepstorian, where What If whispers timeless tales into dreams. Breathe deeply, let your mind soften, and drift into tonight's gentle story. What if beneath the murky waters of a fog-wrapped river, ancient mysteries stirred in the depths, calling to curious minds who sought truth in the gaslit shadows of a great city? So dim the lights, find your most comfortable position, and let these whispered narratives carry you softly towards sleep. The Thames moved like liquid shadow through the heart of London, its dark waters carrying secrets older than the great city itself. November mist clung to the river's surface, soft and grey as forgotten dreams, while gas lamps flickered their amber light across the cobblestones of the embankment. The year was 1893, and the air held that peculiar weight of approaching winter, when the world seemed to hold its breath and listen to the whispers of the past. In the gentle glow of evening, the city revealed its softer face. Smoke from countless chimneys rose in lazy spirals, mixing with the fog to create a blanket that muffled sound and softened edges. The clip-clop of horse hooves echoed distantly, a rhythmic lullaby against the ancient stones. Window panes glowed golden from within, suggesting warmth and comfort behind lace curtains, while the Thames flowed endlessly onward, carrying with it the dreams and sorrows of generations. It was on such an evening that the first whispers reached the ears of those who lived by the water's edge. Dock workers spoke in hushed tones of strange sounds, echoing from beneath the bridges after midnight. Fishermen returned with tales of nets torn by something vast and unseen in the river's depths. The stories spread like ripples across still water, growing larger with each telling, until they reached the comfortable sitting room at 221 Baker Street. Dr. John Watson sat by the fire, the warm light playing across the pages of his evening newspaper. The flames danced in the grate, casting gentle shadows that moved like living things across the wallpaper. Outside, the November rain tapped softly against the windows, a peaceful percussion that spoke of home and safety. The room smelled of pipe tobacco and old leather, of tea leaves, and the faint mustiness of well-loved books. It was a sanctuary from the world's harsh edges, a place where thoughts could wander freely and the spirit could rest. Across from Watson, in the depths of a well-worn armchair, sat Sherlock Holmes. His lean form was draped in his familiar dressing gown, and his fingers were steepled beneath his chin as he gazed into the fire. The detective's grey eyes reflected the dancing flames, and there was something in his expression that suggested his mind was far from the comfortable warmth of their shared lodgings. He had been unusually quiet that evening, lost in thoughts that seemed to pull him toward some distant shore of contemplation. The fire crackled softly, sending up tiny sparks that glowed briefly before disappearing into the darkness of the chimney. Watson turned a page of his newspaper, the sound crisp and comforting in the quiet room. Outside, London continued its eternal dance of light and shadow, but here, in this moment, time seemed suspended like dust motes in a beam of sunlight. "Holmes," Watson said gently, his voice barely disturbing the peaceful atmosphere, "you've been remarkably contemplative this evening. Has something captured your interest?" Holmes stirred slightly as if awakening from a dream. His fingers unfolded slowly and he reached for his pipe, the movement languid and thoughtful. "Indeed, my dear Watson, I find myself drawn to a most curious collection of reports that have been filtering through the less reputable channels of our city's information network." The detective's voice held that familiar note of intrigue, but tonight it was tempered with something softer, more reflective. He packed his pipe with deliberate care, each movement precise yet unhurried. The tobacco was fragrant and rich, adding its earthly perfume to the room's comfortable atmosphere. Watson folded his newspaper and settled more deeply into his chair. Years of partnership had taught him to recognize when Holmes was on the verge of revealing something significant, and tonight there was something different in the air. A quality of mystery that seemed to shimmer just beyond the edges of perception. "What manner of reports?" Watson asked, his medical training lending a note of gentle curiosity to the question. Holmes struck a match. the brief flare illuminating his angular features before settling into the steady glow of burning tobacco. He drew slowly on the pipe, the smoke curling upward in lazy spirals that caught the firelight and danced toward the ceiling. For a moment the only sounds were the gentle hiss of the fire and the distant murmur of rain against glass. Stories from the Thames, Watson. Curious tales of disruption and, shall we say, encounters of an unusual nature. Holmes paused, his eyes growing distant as if seeing beyond the walls of their sitting room to the dark waters that flowed through London's heart. 3 separate incidents in the past fortnight, each involving vessels that have met with unexpected difficulties while navigating our beloved river. The word beloved carried a note of irony, but also something deeper, an acknowledgement of the Thames as London's lifeline, its flowing heart that connected past to present, carrying stories in its currents like messages in bottles cast by previous generations. Watson leaned forward slightly, drawn by the mystery but also by the unusual quality in Holmes's voice. What sort of difficulties? Ah, that is where the tale becomes truly intriguing. Holmes took another draw from his pipe, the tobacco glowing like a tiny star in the gathering dusk. The first incident involved the merchant vessel Catherine Marie, a sturdy craft that has plied these waters for the better part of a decade without incident. 3 nights ago she was discovered listing badly near London Bridge, her crew in a state of considerable distress. The fire settled lower in the grate, the flames growing smaller but no less hypnotic in their gentle dance. Outside, the rain continued its soft percussion, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour with deep, resonant notes that seemed to echo through the fog-shrouded streets. The crew reported, Holmes continued, his voice taking on the measured cadence of one who has sifted carefully through conflicting accounts, that something of tremendous size had risen from beneath their vessel during the small hours of the morning. They described tentacles, Watson, massive appendages that emerge from the water and wrap themselves around the ship's hull with sufficient force to crack the timbers. Watson felt a small shiver, though whether from the story or the cooling air he could not say. The room seemed to grow quieter, as if the very walls were leaning in to listen to Holmes's tale. Tentacles, Watson repeated softly, tasting the word. Rather like an octopus, you mean? Rather like, Holmes agreed, though the scale described would make even the largest known cephalopod seem like a child's toy by comparison. The crew estimated the thickness of these appendages at something approaching 2 feet in diameter, and they spoke of a length that disappeared into the murky depths without revealing its full extent. The detective rose from his chair with fluid grace, moving to the window, where he stood gazing out at the gas-lit street below. The yellow glow of the street lamps created pools of warm light in the darkness, and the fog moved between them like living things, soft and ethereal. Holmes's reflection was ghostly in the glass, his profile sharp against the gentle illumination of the room behind him. The second incident, he continued, his breath creating a small patch of fog on the window pane, occurred 2 nights later. The fishing boat Molly's Dream, returning from the estuary with the evening's catch, reported a similar encounter near the Tower Bridge. This time, however, there were witnesses on shore, dock workers finishing their late shift who claimed to have seen something vast and dark moving beneath the water's surface. Watson rose as well, drawn to join his friend at the window. Together they looked out at the London night, where fog and lamplight created a world of soft edges and gentle mysteries. The city seemed to breathe around them, its heartbeat the distant rumble of late carriages and the whisper of wind through narrow alleyways. And the third incident, Watson prompted, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might disturb the delicate atmosphere that had settled over their conversation. Ah, the third. Holmes's reflection smiled, though there was something troubled in the expression. That occurred just yesterday evening, and it is what has brought these matters to my attention in such a pointed fashion. The pleasure craft Lady Beatrice was hosting a small evening party, members of Parliament and their wives, enjoying a civilized cruise along our historic waterway. The detective turned from the window, his movements slow and thoughtful. The firelight caught the planes of his face, highlighting the sharp intelligence in his eyes, while softening the austere lines of his features. He moved with the grace of a man whose mind and body worked in perfect harmony, each gesture deliberate yet natural. "The Lady Beatrice," Holmes continued, settling once again into his chair, "is a vessel of considerable size and stability. Her captain has navigated these waters for more than 20 years without a single significant incident. Yet yesterday evening, as the party was enjoying their after-dinner brandy, and the ladies were admiring the moonlight on the water, something rose from the depths with sufficient force to lift the bow of the ship several feet above its normal waterline." Watson returned to his chair as well, drawn by the warmth of the fire and the compelling nature of Holmes's narrative. The room had taken on an intimate quality, as if the walls had drawn closer to better contain the mystery that was unfolding between them. "The guests," Holmes said, his voice taking on a note of dry amusement, "were most emphatically not prepared for such an encounter. Several of the ladies fainted, one gentleman was heard to call upon his maker with considerable enthusiasm, and the captain found himself faced with the rather unprecedented challenge of explaining to a member of the House of Lords why his wife's evening gown was now thoroughly soaked with Thames water of questionable purity." Despite the mysterious nature of the tale, Watson found himself smiling at the image. There was something delightfully absurd about the collision of London's refined society with the ancient mysteries of the river that had given the city life. But more importantly, Holmes continued, his tone growing more serious, several of the witnesses provided remarkably consistent descriptions of what they had seen. Tentacles, Watson, of extraordinary size and apparent strength, smooth, dark appendages that glistened in the moonlight as they rose from the water and briefly explored the ship's hull before withdrawing once again into the depths. The fire crackled softly, sending up a small shower of sparks that glowed briefly against the dark mouth of the chimney. Outside, the rain had gentled to a fine mist, and the gas lamps created halos of soft light in the gathering fog. London was settling into its evening rhythm, the great city drawing its cloak of darkness around itself like a comfortable blanket. Watson steepled his fingers, unconsciously mimicking his friend's familiar gesture. 3 incidents in a fortnight, all involving encounters with something of considerable size residing in the Thames. I assume the authorities have been notified." "Indeed they have," Holmes replied, reaching for a small pile of correspondence that lay on the table beside his chair. "Inspector Lestrade has been kind enough to share the official reports, along with his own considerable scepticism regarding the reliability of the witnesses involved." The detective's fingers moved through the papers with practiced efficiency, each document clearly familiar to him already. The papers rustled softly, a dry whisper that harmonized with the gentle sounds of the fire and the distant murmur of the city beyond their windows. "Lestrade's position," Holmes continued, "is that we are dealing with a case of mass hysteria, possibly triggered by some unusual but perfectly explicable phenomenon. Debris in the water, perhaps, or an unusually large piece of driftwood that has been mistaken for something more exotic in the uncertain light of evening and early morning." Watson nodded thoughtfully. It was a reasonable explanation, the sort of practical interpretation that his medical training had taught him to value. Yet something in Holmes's manner suggested that the detective was not entirely satisfied with such a prosaic solution. "And your assessment of the inspector's theory?" Watson asked. Holmes was quiet for a long moment, his grey eyes fixed on the dancing flames in the grate. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of uncertainty that was unusual for the typically confident consulting detective. "I find myself reluctant to dismiss these accounts so readily, Watson. The witnesses, while certainly affected by their experiences, do not appear to be suffering from any form of delusion or hysteria. Their descriptions are remarkably consistent, even accounting for the natural variations one would expect from individuals observing an unusual phenomenon under less than ideal conditions." The detective rose again, this time moving to his desk where he retrieved a small magnifying glass and what appeared to be several photographs. His movements were precise, almost ritualistic, as if the handling of evidence was a sacred act that required both reverence and complete attention. "Furthermore," Holmes continued, returning to his chair with the materials in hand, I have obtained these rather interesting photographs from the scene of yesterday's encounter with Lady Beatrice." He handed the first photograph to Watson, who accepted it with careful fingers. The image was grainy and indistinct, taken in poor light with what was clearly a handheld camera. Yet even in the uncertain reproduction, Watson could make out what appeared to be the side of a large vessel, and there, just at the edge of the waterline, something dark and curved that seemed to emerge from beneath the surface. The photographer, Holmes explained, was a guest aboard the Lady Beatrice who had the presence of mind to retrieve his camera during the excitement. While the quality leaves something to be desired, you will note the distinctive curve of what appears to be a large appendage just visible at the water's surface. Watson studied the image carefully, holding it closer to the fire to take advantage of the additional light. The photograph seemed to shimmer in the flickering illumination, and for a moment he could almost imagine that the dark shape in the image was moving, undulating with a life of its own. "It could be many things," Watson said finally, though his voice carried less conviction than his words might suggest. "A piece of rope, perhaps, or some other debris that has caught the light in an unusual way." "It could indeed," Holmes agreed, though his tone suggested he found such explanations less than satisfying. "However, I've also obtained this rather more intriguing piece of evidence." The detective handed Watson a second photograph, this one somewhat clearer despite having been taken under similar conditions. The image showed a section of the river's surface, disturbed by what appeared to be a significant upwelling of water. The disturbance was roughly circular, perhaps 20 feet in diameter, and at its centre something dark and substantial could be seen just beneath the surface. Watson felt his breath catch slightly as he studied the image. There was something about the shape in the water that defied easy explanation, something that suggested both massive size and organic complexity. The dark form seemed to possess a quality of purposeful movement, as if it were not merely floating debris but something alive and aware. "This photograph," Holmes said softly, "was taken by a different individual entirely, a dock worker who happened to possess a camera and sufficient presence of mind to use it during the encounter with Molly's dream. Note the similarity in the disturbance pattern to what we observed in the previous image, despite the completely independent circumstances of the two incidents." The room grew very quiet as Watson contemplated the implications of what he was seeing. Outside, London continued its nightly ritual of settling into darkness, but here, in the warm glow of their sitting room, a mystery was taking shape that seemed to challenge the very foundations of rational thought. Holmes retrieved his pipe from the table beside his chair, though he made no move to light it. Instead, he held it between his fingers like a talisman, drawing some sort of comfort from its familiar weight and texture. His eyes remained fixed on Watson's face, studying his friend's reaction to the evidence with the same intensity brought to bear on any puzzle that captured his interest. "I confess," Holmes said finally, "that I find myself in the unusual position of being uncertain how to proceed. The evidence, while intriguing, is far from conclusive. The witnesses, while apparently sincere, have observed something that challenges our understanding of what is possible in these familiar waters, and yet—" The detective's voice trailed off, and he gazed once more into the fire as if seeking answers in the dancing flames. The coals glowed red-hot at the grate's heart, pulsing like the heart of some sleeping creature, while the yellow flames above them flickered and swayed in response to invisible currents in the room's warm air. "And yet?" Watson prompted gently. Holmes sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of all the mysteries he had encountered in his long career. "And yet I find that my scepticism is tempered by a most uncomfortable sense that we may be dealing with something that lies beyond the scope of ordinary criminal investigation." The admission hung in the air between them like smoke from Holmes's pipe, substantial yet ephemeral. Watson set the photographs aside and leaned back in his chair, allowing the warmth of the fire to wash over him as he considered the implications of his friend's words. For Sherlock Holmes to admit uncertainty was unusual enough. For him to suggest that they might be facing something beyond the reach of rational investigation was almost unprecedented. Throughout their long partnership, Watson had seen the detective tackle mysteries that had baffled Scotland Yard, unravelling complex webs of deception and crime through the application of pure logic and careful observation. To hear him now speak of matters that might lie beyond such methods was both troubling and oddly thrilling. The fire settled lower in the grate, the flames growing smaller as the evening progressed toward night. Outside their windows, the gas lamps created islands of golden light in the gathering darkness, while fog rolled off the Thames in gentle waves that softened the harsh edges of the industrial city. It was a night made for mysteries, Watson reflected. A night when the impossible seemed to hover just at the edges of perception, waiting to be invited into the warm circle of human understanding. "What do you propose we do?" Watson asked finally, his voice barely disturbing the peaceful quiet that had settled over their conversation. Holmes smiled, and for the first time that evening, his expression held something of its usual confidence. "I propose, my dear Watson, that we pay a visit to the Thames tomorrow evening. If there is indeed something unusual residing in our river's depths, I believe we may be able to coax it into revealing itself more fully." The prospect sent a small thrill through Watson's chest, a familiar excitement that always accompanied the beginning of a new investigation. Yet there was something different about this mystery, something that seemed to reach beyond the comfortable boundaries of their usual cases into territory that was both ancient and unknown. Holmes rose from his chair and moved to the window once more, his tall form silhouetted against the gentle glow of the street lamps below. He stood very still, his hands clasped behind his back, gazing out at the fog-shrouded city as if he could see through its veils to the dark waters that flowed at its heart. "There is something else, Watson," he said softly, his breath fogging the glass. "Something I have not yet mentioned." Watson joined his friend at the window, the two of them standing side by side in the gentle illumination that filled their sitting room. Beyond the glass, London spread out before them like a vast organism, its lights twinkling through the fog like stars glimpsed through clouds. "During my inquiries today," Holmes continued, "I had occasion to visit the British Museum. Professor Whitmore, whom you may recall from the Addleton case, has been most helpful in providing historical context for these recent events." The detective paused, as if carefully considering his words. In the distance, a clock tower chimed the half-hour, its deep notes echoing through the misty air with a resonance that seemed to vibrate in the very stones of the city. "It appears," Holmes said finally, "that similar incidents have been recorded in London's past, though with such infrequency that they have largely been relegated to the realm of folklore and superstition. Professor Whitmore was able to provide me with references to accounts dating back nearly 3 centuries, tales of encounters with something vast and tentacled that emerges from the Thames during periods of particular darkness or disturbance." Watson felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November air beyond their windows. The idea that these recent incidents might be part of a pattern stretching back through the centuries added a dimension to the mystery that was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. "The accounts," Holmes continued, "are remarkably consistent in their descriptions. A creature of immense size, possessed of numerous tentacles and apparently residing in the deeper portions of the river. The stories speak of encounters that last only brief moments before the creature retreats once more to its hidden domain, leaving behind only damaged vessels and thoroughly shaken witnesses. The fire in the grate had burned down to glowing coals, casting a warm red light that painted the room in shades of amber and shadow. Outside, the fog continued to thicken, transforming the familiar streets of London into a landscape of mystery and half-glimpsed possibilities. Holmes turned from the window, his movements slow and thoughtful. In the dim light, his angular features seemed more pronounced, giving him the appearance of some ancient scholar contemplating mysteries that lay at the very foundations of human knowledge. "Professor Whitmore suggested," Holmes said, settling once more into his chair, "that we might be dealing with a creature that has existed in the Thames for far longer than London itself. Something that was here when the Romans first built their settlement on the river's banks. Something that has watched the rise and fall of empires while remaining hidden in the dark waters that flow beneath our great city. The idea was both thrilling and deeply humbling." Watson found himself imagining the Thames not as the familiar waterway that carried commerce and pleasure craft through the heart of Victorian London, but as something far more ancient and mysterious, a liquid pathway that connected the present moment to depths of time that the human mind could barely comprehend. If such a creature exists, Watson said slowly, why would it reveal itself now? What has changed to draw it from whatever depths it has occupied for so many centuries? Holmes reached for his pipe once more, striking a match to relight the tobacco that had grown cold during their conversation. The brief flare of the match illuminated his features, highlighting the sharp intelligence in his eyes while creating dancing shadows on the walls around them. That, my dear Watson, he said as the match died away, is precisely the question that I hope we may be able to answer. Though I suspect that the answer, when we find it, may prove to be far more complex and unsettling than anything we have encountered in our previous investigations. The night had settled fully over London by now, transforming the city into a realm of gaslit islands connected by fog-shrouded channels of darkness. From their window, Watson could see the occasional figure hurrying along the pavement below, bent against the damp chill and eager to reach the warmth and safety of home. Yet even as the city prepared for sleep, he could not shake the feeling that somewhere in the darkness, ancient eyes were watching from beneath the black waters of the Thames. Holmes drew slowly on his pipe, the tobacco glowing like a tiny beacon in the gathering dark of their sitting room. Neither man felt inclined to light the gas lamps. There was something appropriate about contemplating this particular mystery in the gentle illumination of firelight, as if the warm glow connected them to all the generations who had gathered around fires to tell stories of things that moved in the darkness beyond human understanding. "I have arranged," Holmes said eventually, "for us to meet tomorrow evening with Captain Morrison of the River Police. He has agreed to provide us with a patrol boat and to share what additional information his men may have gathered regarding these incidents." The prospect of venturing onto the Thames at night, armed with nothing more than their wits and whatever courage they could muster, should have been daunting. Yet Watson found himself looking forward to the adventure with the same anticipation he had felt as a young man preparing for his first posting to Afghanistan. There was something about the unknown that called to the adventurous spirit, something that made the safe comfort of their sitting room seem suddenly confining. Holmes seemed to sense his friend's mood, for the detective's eyes crinkled slightly with amusement. "I can see that the prospect appeals to you, Watson, though I feel I should warn you that we may find ourselves confronting something that lies well beyond the scope of our usual criminal adversaries." "All the more reason to approach it with open minds," Watson replied. "After all, the history of human discovery is largely a record of encounters with the previously impossible. The coals in the grate pulsed with deep red light, casting warm reflections on the surfaces of their brandy glasses and highlighting the comfortable disorder that characterized their shared lodgings. Books lay open on tables, papers were scattered across Holmes's desk, and the familiar detritus of their domestic life created an atmosphere of lived-in warmth that stood in sharp contrast to the mysteries they were contemplating. Yet even as they sat in the comfort of their familiar surroundings, Watson found his thoughts drawn inexorably to the dark waters that flowed through London's heart. Somewhere beneath those murky depths, if the witnesses were to be believed, something ancient and vast was stirring. Something that had remained hidden for centuries was now revealing itself to human eyes, and the implications of that revelation were both thrilling and deeply unsettling. The clock in the hallway chimed 11, its steady notes marking the passage of time in the quiet house. Mrs. Hudson had long since retired to her rooms below, leaving the two friends alone with their thoughts and the gentle sounds of the dying fire. Outside, London had settled into its nightly rhythm, the great city breathing slowly as it prepared for sleep. Holmes set his pipe aside and reached for the photographs once more, studying them in the dim light with the intense concentration he brought to all evidence. His long fingers traced the edges of the images as if he could divine additional information through touch alone, and his grey eyes moved across the grainy surfaces with microscopic attention to detail. "There is something here," he murmured, more to himself than to Watson. "Something in the pattern of the disturbance that suggests—" He trailed off, his brow furrowing with concentration. Watson moved closer, peering over his friend's shoulder at the photographs. In the uncertain light of the dying fire, the images seemed to take on new qualities, shadows shifting and form suggesting possibilities, that had not been apparent under the brighter illumination of gas lamps. "What do you see?" Watson asked softly. Holmes held one of the photographs closer to the coals, using their red glow to illuminate details that had been hidden in shadow. "The water displacement," he said finally. "Notice how it radiates outward from a central point, but not in the random pattern you would expect from debris or driftwood. There is something deliberate about the formation, something that suggests purposeful movement rather than passive floating." Watson studied the image more carefully, trying to see what Holmes had detected in the grainy reproduction. Gradually, he began to discern what his friend meant. The disturbance in the water did indeed show a pattern that seemed too organised to be accidental, too purposeful to be explained by simple debris. Furthermore, Holmes continued, note the size of the displacement. For the water to be disturbed in such a manner would require something of tremendous bulk moving beneath the surface. Not merely large, Watson, but massive on a scale that challenges our understanding of what could exist undetected in these waters. The implication sent a small shiver through Watson's frame. The Thames, for all its size and historical significance, was hardly an ocean. It was a river that flowed through one of the world's great cities, travelled daily by countless vessels and bordered by miles of developed shoreline. The idea that something of truly massive proportions could exist in such waters without being detected seemed to defy rational explanation. Yet the evidence before them suggested that rational explanation might not be adequate to encompass whatever they were dealing with. The photographs, the witness accounts, the historical records that Holmes had uncovered all pointed towards something that existed at the very boundaries of the possible, something that challenged the comfortable certainties of Victorian scientific understanding. Holmes set the photographs aside and leaned back in his chair, his hands steepled beneath his chin in his characteristic pose of deep contemplation. The fire had burned down to mere embers now, casting a deep red glow that transformed the familiar sitting room into something ancient and mysterious. "I find myself reminded," he said softly, "of a conversation I once had with Professor Challenger regarding the possibility of survival forms that have persisted unchanged since the Earth's earliest ages. His theories regarding the continuity of ancient life in isolated environments were quite fascinating, though I confess I found them somewhat fanciful at the time." Watson settled back into his own chair, drawn by the quiet intensity of Holmes's voice and the implications of his words. Outside their windows, the fog had grown so thick that the gas lamps were barely visible through the grey shroud that had settled over London. Challenger's position, Holmes continued, was that under certain circumstances, isolation, adequate food supply, stable environmental conditions, creatures that evolved in the Earth's primordial seas might continue to exist in hidden pockets of their original habitat. He suggested that deep lakes, underground caverns connected to the sea, or even the deeper portions of ancient rivers might serve as refugia for forms of life that the rest of the world considers extinct. The idea was breathtaking in its implications. Watson tried to imagine creatures from the dawn of life on Earth, swimming in the dark depths beneath London's bustling streets, hidden from human eyes, but sharing the same waters that carried the city's commerce and supported its daily life. "Do you believe," Watson asked carefully, "that we might be dealing with such a survivor?" Holmes was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the glowing coals that were all that remained of their evening fire. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of wonder that Watson had rarely heard from the typically rational detective. "I believe, my dear Watson, that we are approaching the edges of human knowledge, where the familiar categories of criminal investigation give way to mysteries that are far more profound. Whether we are dealing with an ancient survivor, some previously unknown species, or something else entirely, I cannot say. But I am convinced that tomorrow evening's expedition will provide us with answers to questions we have barely begun to formulate." The prospect filled Watson with a mixture of excitement and trepidation that reminded him of his younger days, when the world had seemed full of undiscovered possibilities, and every horizon had promised new adventures. Age and experience had not dulled his appreciation for mystery, and the thought of venturing into unknown territory alongside his trusted friend awakened all his old enthusiasm for exploration and discovery. The clock chimed midnight, its deep notes echoing through the quiet house and marking the transition from one day to the next. The fire had died to glowing ash, and the room was growing cool as the November chill began to seep through the windows. Yet neither man seemed inclined to retire. There was something about this particular night that invited extended contemplation, as if the darkness itself was conducive to thoughts of mysteries and possibilities. Holmes rose from his chair and moved to the bookshelf that lined one wall of their sitting room. His fingers traced along the leather-bound spines until he found what he was seeking, a thick volume that Watson recognised as one of the detective's reference works on maritime history. "I thought you might find this interesting," Holmes said, returning to his chair with the book in hand. "A collection of accounts relating to unusual maritime encounters in British waters, compiled by a retired sea captain with rather more imagination than most of his profession." The detective opened the volume to a page he had obviously marked earlier, holding it so that both men could read in the dim light of the dying embers. The page contained a woodcut illustration depicting a sailing vessel in apparent distress, surrounded by what appeared to be massive tentacles emerging from churning waters. "This account," Holmes said softly, "dates from 1743. A merchant vessel sailing up the Thames toward London encountered something that the captain described as a creature of the deep, possessed of arms like unto the mightiest serpents, which did rise from the waters and embrace our vessel with such force that our timbers groaned, as if the very ship were in the grip of some titan of the sea." Watson studied the illustration carefully, noting the artist's attempt to capture both the terror of the encounter and the sheer scale of the creature described in the accompanying text. The tentacles were depicted as being of enormous thickness, wrapped around the ship's hull with crushing force, while the vessel's crew was shown in various attitudes of panic and desperation. "The captain's log," Holmes continued, "records that the encounter lasted perhaps 10 minutes before the creature released the vessel and disappeared once more beneath the surface. The ship sustained significant damage but was able to make port, where the captain's account was met with considerable scepticism, despite the physical evidence of the damaged hull." Holmes turned several pages, revealing additional accounts from different centuries. Each story bore remarkable similarities to the others, despite being separated by decades or even centuries. Ships encountered on the Thames, massive tentacles, brief but terrifying confrontations followed by the creature's mysterious withdrawal to the depths. "The pattern," Holmes observed, "suggests something that surfaces periodically, perhaps in response to specific conditions or stimuli that we do not yet understand. The intervals between sightings appear to vary considerably, which may explain why these encounters have been relegated to the realm of folklore rather than serious investigation." Watson found himself studying not just the accounts but the illustrations that accompanied them. Each artist had depicted the creature somewhat differently, yet all shared certain consistent elements: the massive size, the tentacular appendages, and the sense of something ancient and alien intruding upon the familiar world of human maritime activity. "Holmes," Watson said slowly, "if such a creature has indeed been dwelling in the Thames for centuries, why would it choose to surface now? What has changed that might draw it from whatever depths it has inhabited?" The detective closed the book and set it aside, his expression thoughtful. "That is perhaps the most intriguing question of all, Watson. London has changed dramatically over the past century. The river traffic has increased exponentially, industrial activities along the banks have intensified, and the very composition of the water itself has been altered by human activity." Holmes paused, gazing toward the window where fog pressed against the glass like a living thing seeking entry. "Perhaps we have finally disturbed something that has remained undisturbed for too long. Perhaps our expansion, our constant activity along and upon the river, has reached some threshold that has provoked a response from something that has watched our growth with increasing concern." The idea was both fascinating and troubling. Watson imagined some vast intelligence dwelling in the river's depths, observing the gradual transformation of its domain as London grew from a modest settlement to one of the world's great cities. What would such a creature make of the ships that now crowded its waters, the industrial waste that clouded its ancient clarity, the endless human activity that had transformed every mile of its banks. Or perhaps, Holmes continued, his voice growing more speculative, the creature is responding to some change in its own circumstances. Age, injury, the need to seek new hunting grounds. There are many factors that might prompt a previously secretive creature to reveal itself to human observation. The fog outside their window had grown so thick that it obscured everything beyond the immediate vicinity of their building. The gas lamps were reduced to dim halos of yellow light floating in a grey void, and the familiar sounds of London's nighttime activity were muffled to whispers that seemed to come from another world entirely. Watson found himself drawn to the window, pressing his palm against the cool glass as he peered into the impenetrable greyness beyond. The fog seemed to pulse with its own life, shifting and swirling in patterns that suggested movement just beyond the range of perception. Somewhere in that grey shroud, the Thames flowed on toward the sea, carrying its ancient secrets through the heart of the sleeping city. "Tomorrow evening cannot come quickly enough," Watson said softly, his breath creating a small patch of condensation on the glass. "I find myself increasingly curious about what revelations await us." Holmes joined him at the window, the two friends standing side by side in the dim light of their sitting room. The detective's reflection was ghostly in the glass, his angular features made even sharper by the interplay of firelight and shadow. "I confess to sharing your anticipation," Holmes replied, "though I suspect that what we discover may challenge our understanding of the world in ways we have not yet imagined." The night had grown very late now, and the comfortable warmth of their sitting room seemed like a sanctuary against the mysteries that waited in the fog-shrouded darkness beyond their walls. Yet even as they prepared to retire, both men found their thoughts drawn inexorably to the dark waters that flowed through London's heart, and to the possibility that something ancient and vast was stirring in those hidden depths. The morning that followed brought little relief from the fog that had shrouded London through the night. Watson woke to find their windows still obscured by the grey veil, and the city beyond seemed muffled and distant, as if the entire metropolis had been wrapped in cotton wool. The familiar sounds of street vendors, carriages, and pedestrians were reduced to whispers that drifted through the mist like voices from a half-remembered dream. Holmes was already awake when Watson emerged from his bedroom, standing by the sitting-room window with a cup of tea in his hands and an expression of intense concentration on his face. He had dressed with his usual care, but there was something different about his demeanour this morning, a quality of focused anticipation that suggested his mind was already engaged with the evening's planned expedition. "Good morning, Watson," Holmes said without turning from the window. "I trust you slept well, despite the rather unusual atmospheric conditions." Watson accepted a cup of tea from the service Mrs. Hudson had left on their table, grateful for the warmth that spread through his hands and the familiar comfort of their morning ritual. Outside, the fog pressed against their windows like a living thing, reducing the world beyond to shapes and suggestions that seemed to shift and change whenever observed directly. "Reasonably well," Watson replied, settling into his chair near the fire, "though I confess to having rather vivid dreams involving tentacles and dark water. I suspect our conversation last evening may have affected my subconscious more than I initially realised." Holmes turned from the window with a slight smile, his grey eyes bright with the particular enthusiasm that always marked the beginning of a new investigation. He moved with fluid grace to his own chair, settling into the familiar surroundings with the ease of long habit. "Dreams often provide insights that our waking minds miss," the detective observed. "I would be interested to hear what specific details your subconscious may have conjured." Watson considered the fragments he could recall from his night's rest. Images of vast shapes moving beneath dark water, the sense of something immense and alien watching from hidden depths, the feeling of standing on the edge of discoveries that would change everything he thought he knew about the world. "Nothing particularly coherent," he admitted. "More impressions than specific images, but there was a sense of antiquity, I suppose, as if whatever we might encounter has been present far longer than human civilization, watching and waiting for reasons we cannot comprehend." Holmes nodded thoughtfully, his fingers steepled beneath his chin in his characteristic pose of deep contemplation. "An interesting observation, and one that aligns with the historical patterns I've been researching. If the accounts we reviewed last evening are accurate, we may indeed be dealing with something that has observed the rise and fall of empires from its hidden vantage point beneath the Thames. The fire crackled softly in the grate, providing a warm counterpoint to the grey chill that seemed to permeate the fog-shrouded morning. Mrs. Hudson's breakfast preparations could be heard from the kitchen below, the familiar sounds of domestic routine providing a reassuring anchor to the everyday world, even as their conversation ventured into realms of mystery and possibility. Holmes rose and moved to his desk, where a collection of papers and books had accumulated during his research of the previous day. His movements were precise and purposeful as he sorted through the materials, selecting items that had clearly caught his attention during his investigations. "I spent several hours last evening, after you retired, corresponding with various maritime authorities and historical societies," he said, holding up a small stack of telegrams and letters. "The responses have been most illuminating, though in ways I had not entirely anticipated." Watson set down his teacup and moved closer, drawn by the familiar excitement that accompanied Holmes's research activities. The detective's ability to extract information from diverse sources and synthesize it into meaningful patterns was one of his most remarkable talents, and Watson had learned to pay careful attention whenever his friend announced new discoveries. "What manner of illumination?" Watson asked. Holmes selected one of the telegrams and held it so that Watson could read the text alongside him. The message was brief but intriguing, sent from the Maritime Records Office and bearing the previous evening's timestamp. "Reference your inquiry regarding Thames anomalies. Stop similar patterns. Recorded. Bristol Channel 1874. Stop also 7 Estuary 1861. Stop. Suggest consultation. Professor Blackwood. Royal Maritime Museum. Stop. Urgent attention. Recommended stop." Watson read the message twice, absorbing the implications of what it suggested. The idea that similar incidents had occurred in other British waterways added a new dimension to their investigation, suggesting that whatever they were dealing with might not be confined to the Thames alone. "Additional incidents," Watson mused. "The pattern may be broader than we initially suspected." "Indeed," Holmes agreed, setting the telegram aside and reaching for another document. "This letter from Professor Blackwood arrived by special delivery this morning, in response to my inquiry of yesterday evening." The letter was written in a precise scholarly hand on the letterhead of the Royal Maritime Museum. Watson noted that it was dated the previous evening and marked for urgent delivery, suggesting that Professor Blackwood had considered Holmes's inquiry to be of considerable importance. "My dear Mr. Holmes," the letter began, "your telegram regarding recent Thames anomalies has arrived at a most fortuitous moment. I have been researching similar phenomena for several years, though until now I have found few individuals willing to consider my findings with the seriousness they merit. The incidents you describe fit a pattern that extends far beyond the Thames, encompassing waterways throughout Britain and indeed much of northwestern Europe. My research suggests that we may be observing the periodic surfacing of creatures that have remained hidden in deep water refugia for extraordinary periods of time. I would very much like to meet with you at your earliest convenience to share my findings and to learn more about your current investigation. The implications, I believe, extend far beyond simple maritime curiosities and touch upon questions of natural history that could revolutionize our understanding of life on Earth. I remain, sir, your most interested colleague, Professor Edmund Blackwood, Royal Maritime Museum." Watson felt a thrill of excitement as he absorbed the contents of the letter. The idea that their investigation might be part of a larger pattern of discovery was both exhilarating and slightly overwhelming. What had begun as a local mystery involving unusual incidents on the Thames was apparently connected to phenomena that spanned multiple countries and potentially centuries of hidden history. Holmes folded the letter carefully and set it aside with the other correspondence. His expression was thoughtful, and Watson could see that he was already formulating plans for incorporating this new information into their investigation. "I have arranged to meet with Professor Blackwood this afternoon," Holmes said. "His expertise may prove invaluable in understanding what we might encounter this evening. In the meantime, I suggest we pay a visit to the scene of last night's most recent incident. The prospect of examining physical evidence was appealing, and Watson found himself eager to apply his medical training to whatever traces might remain of the mysterious encounters. The morning fog would provide excellent cover for their investigations, allowing them to examine the areas in question without attracting unwanted attention from curious observers. Holmes moved to the window once more, gazing out at the grey shroud that continued to envelop London. The fog showed no signs of lifting, creating an atmosphere that seemed perfectly suited to their mysterious investigation. The familiar city had been transformed into something alien and otherworldly, where familiar landmarks became ghostly suggestions, and every shadow might conceal secrets waiting to be discovered. "The fog may actually work to our advantage," Holmes observed. "It will allow us to examine the docking areas without interference, and it may also encourage our mysterious visitor to reveal itself more readily this evening. Many deep-water creatures are more active during periods of reduced visibility." Watson collected his coat and medical bag, the familiar weight of his instruments providing a reassuring connection to the rational world of scientific investigation. Whatever mysteries awaited them, he was determined to approach them with the same methodical attention to detail that had served him well throughout his medical career. The journey to the Thames embankment proved to be an adventure in itself. The fog had transformed London into a maze of half-glimpsed landmarks and muffled sounds, where familiar streets became uncertain pathways, and even the most experienced cabbie moved with unusual caution. Their hansom cab proceeded at a careful pace, the driver calling out periodic warnings to other vehicles that materialized and vanished in the grey shroud like ships passing in the night. Holmes sat forward in his seat, his sharp eyes scanning the fog-shrouded landscape for details that might prove significant to their investigation. Even in these obscured conditions, the detective's powers of observation remained undiminished, and Watson knew that he was cataloguing every sound, every movement, every subtle variation in the fog's density for potential future relevance. When they finally reached the embankment near London Bridge, the fog had created an atmosphere that was both ethereal and vaguely menacing. The Thames was completely invisible beyond the stone railing, hidden beneath a grey blanket that seemed to muffle even the sound of the flowing water. Gas lamps flickered like distant stars in the murky air, providing just enough illumination to suggest the presence of familiar structures without revealing their actual forms. Holmes led the way to the mooring area where the Catherine Marie had been discovered 3 nights earlier. The dock was deserted in the fog, its usual bustle of activity reduced to occasional shadows that moved like ghosts through the grey veil. Their footsteps echoed strangely in the muffled air, creating sounds that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. The detective knelt beside the wooden planking where the damaged vessel had been secured, his magnifying glass catching the dim light as he examined the area with microscopic attention. Watson stood nearby, his medical bag ready should any physical evidence require professional analysis, while his eyes swept the fog-shrouded dock for any signs of the unusual. "Interesting," Holmes murmured, his voice barely audible above the gentle lap of invisible water against the dock pilings. "The wood shows clear signs of pressure damage, but the pattern is unlike anything I have encountered in previous maritime investigations." Watson knelt beside his friend, peering at the planking through the detective's magnifying glass. Even in the poor light he could see what Holmes had detected, deep grooves in the wood that showed a curved organic pattern, unlike the straight lines that would be created by conventional maritime equipment. "The pressure was applied in a rapping motion," Holmes continued, his finger tracing the pattern in the air above the damaged wood. Something large and flexible, capable of exerting tremendous force while conforming to the shape of the surface it was gripping. And the implication sent a small shiver through Watson's frame. The idea that something capable of damaging heavy wooden planking with mere pressure was dwelling in the Thames was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. He found himself glancing nervously toward the invisible water, wondering if even now they might be observed by eyes that had watched from the depths for centuries uncounted. Holmes rose and moved along the dock, his examination methodical and thorough despite the challenging conditions. The fog swirled around them like a living thing, occasionally lifting enough to reveal glimpses of the river's surface before closing in again to obscure everything beyond arm's reach. "Watson," Holmes called softly from a position several yards away, "I believe you should examine this." Watson made his way carefully along the fog-slick planking to where Holmes was kneeling beside what appeared to be a section of damaged railing. The iron had been bent and twisted in a manner that spoke of tremendous force applied from below, as if something had risen from the water with sufficient power to deform the metal barriers that protected pedestrians from the river. "The metal shows signs of contact with something organic," Holmes observed, pointing to dark stains that were barely visible in the dim light. Some form of secretion, perhaps, or simply river water mixed with biological material. Watson opened his medical bag and retrieved a small sample container, carefully scraping a portion of the stained material from the twisted iron. The substance had a peculiar consistency, neither fully liquid nor completely solid, and there was an odour about it that was unfamiliar yet somehow ancient, like the smell of deep ocean caves or tidal pools that had been undisturbed for countless years. "I'll have this analysed as soon as we return to Baker Street," Watson said, sealing the container carefully, "though I suspect conventional chemistry may not provide us with definitive answers." Holmes nodded, his attention already focused on other aspects of the scene. The detective's ability to extract information from physical evidence was remarkable under normal conditions, but the fog and poor lighting were testing even his exceptional skills. They continued their examination of the dock area for another hour, collecting additional samples and documenting the various signs of unusual activity that remained from the previous incidents. The fog never lifted, maintaining its grey shroud over their investigation and creating an atmosphere that seemed perfectly suited to contemplation of mysteries that lay beyond the boundaries of everyday experience. As they prepared to leave the embankment, Watson found himself reluctant to abandon their vantage point beside the hidden river. There was something hypnotic about standing at the edge of the invisible Thames, knowing that somewhere beneath the fog-obscured surface, ancient secrets were waiting to be revealed. Holmes seemed to sense his friend's mood, for the detective paused beside the damaged railing and gazed out into the grey void where the river flowed unseen toward the distant sea. "This evening," Holmes said softly, "we will return with better equipment and the advantage of Captain Morrison's expertise. Whatever mysteries these waters conceal, I believe we are on the verge of significant discoveries." The afternoon meeting with Professor Blackwood proved to be even more illuminating than Holmes had anticipated. The scholar received them in his cramped office at the Royal Maritime Museum, surrounded by charts, books and specimens that spoke of a lifetime dedicated to understanding the mysteries of the sea. Professor Blackwood was a man of perhaps 60 years, with the weathered complexion of someone who had spent considerable time aboard ships, and the intense eyes of a researcher who had encountered phenomena that challenged conventional scientific understanding. His office was a fascinating collection of maritime artifacts, ancient maps, and preserved specimens that created an atmosphere of scholarly investigation mixed with nautical adventure. "Gentlemen," Professor Blackwood said, rising to greet them with obvious enthusiasm, "I cannot express how gratified I am by your interest in these phenomena. For too many years, I have been pursuing these investigations in isolation, dismissed by colleagues who prefer to limit their studies to well-documented and easily explainable phenomena." The professor's manner was that of a man who had finally found kindred spirits, willing to consider possibilities that others rejected out of hand. He moved about his cluttered office with the energy of someone half his age, gathering materials and arranging them on his desk with the practiced efficiency of a lecturer preparing to share his most important discoveries. Holmes settled into one of the chairs Professor Blackwood indicated, his sharp eyes already cataloguing the various artefacts and documents that surrounded them. Watson took the remaining chair, his medical bag at his feet, and his notebook ready to record whatever information the professor might share. "Your telegram," Professor Blackwood continued, returning to his seat behind a desk that was covered with charts and specimens, mentioned recent incidents on the Thames involving encounters with large tentacled creatures. Such accounts are far more common than most people realise, though they are rarely taken seriously by official authorities. The professor opened a large ledger that was filled with meticulous handwriting and detailed sketches. Watson could see that it represented years of careful research, documenting incidents from locations throughout Britain and beyond. "My own investigations," Professor Blackwood explained, "began more than 20 years ago with a chance encounter during a research expedition to the Orkney Islands. We were collecting specimens in the deep waters north of Scotland when our equipment detected something of extraordinary size moving beneath our vessel." The professor's eyes grew distant as he recalled the incident, and Watson could see that the memory remained vivid despite the passage of decades. The creature, for lack of a better term, approached our ship with what appeared to be curiosity rather than aggression. Several members of our party observed massive tentacles that explored our hull for perhaps 10 minutes before the creature withdrew to the depths. The entire encounter was documented in our official reports, though those reports were subsequently buried in the archives and dismissed as the product of overactive imaginations. Holmes leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued by the professor's account. "You mentioned that such incidents are more common than generally realised. What patterns have you identified in your research?" Professor Blackwood turned several pages in his ledger, revealing charts and maps that were marked with dates and locations scattered across the British Isles and beyond. "The sightings follow several distinct patterns," he explained, his finger tracing routes on one of the charts. "First, they tend to occur in deep waterways that have connections to the open ocean, major rivers, estuaries, and coastal areas where fresh and salt water intermingle." Watson studied the marked locations, noting that they included virtually every major waterway in Britain. The Thames, Severn, Mersey, and dozens of smaller rivers were all represented, along with coastal areas from Cornwall to Scotland. "Second," the professor continued, "the incidents appear to follow temporal patterns that may be linked to tidal cycles, seasonal changes, or even longer periodicities that span multiple decades. I have identified what appears to be a roughly 30-year cycle in the frequency of encounters, with peak activity occurring during periods of unusual environmental stress. The implications were fascinating and troubling in equal measure. Watson found himself imagining creatures that had developed behavioural patterns spanning multiple human generations, following rhythms that were tied to natural cycles largely invisible to human observation. And third," Professor Blackwood said, his voice growing more serious, "the encounters appear to be increasing in frequency and boldness over the past several decades. Where once these creatures seemed content to remain hidden in the deepest waters, they now venture into areas of significant human activity, with apparent disregard for the potential consequences." Holmes steepled his fingers beneath his chin, his grey eyes reflecting the same intensity Watson had seen when the detective was confronting particularly complex problems. "What do you believe accounts for this change in behaviour?" Holmes asked. Professor Blackwood was quiet for a moment, clearly considering how to phrase his response. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of years spent contemplating questions that had no easy answers. "I believe we are witnessing the effects of human activity on ecosystems that have remained stable for millennia," he said finally. "Our industrial expansion, our alteration of waterways, our introduction of new forms of pollution and disruption. All of these factors may be forcing creatures that have remained hidden to seek new territories or to defend domains that are increasingly threatened by human encroachment." The idea was both logical and deeply unsettling. Watson imagined ancient creatures watching from hidden depths as their world was gradually transformed by human activity, finally reaching some threshold that prompted them to reveal themselves rather than retreat further into isolation. "Furthermore," Professor Blackwood continued, opening another section of his ledger, "I have reason to believe that these creatures possess intelligence that may equal or exceed our own. The patterns of their appearances, the careful way they avoid direct confrontation while making their presence known, the apparent coordination between incidents across widely separated geographical areas, all of these factors suggest deliberate strategic behaviour, rather than simple animal instinct." The professor showed them detailed charts comparing incident reports from different locations and time periods. Watson could see what the scholar meant about apparent coordination. The timing and nature of encounters showed patterns that seemed too organised to be coincidental. Holmes studied the charts with obvious fascination, his analytical mind clearly engaged with the complex patterns Professor Blackwood had identified. "If your analysis is correct," Holmes said slowly, "then we may be dealing with something far more significant than isolated encounters with unusual wildlife. We may be witnessing the first stages of contact with intelligences that have remained hidden since before the beginning of recorded history." Professor Blackwood nodded gravely. "That is precisely my conclusion, Mr. Holmes, and I fear that our response to these initial contacts may determine whether future encounters remain peaceful or become increasingly confrontational." The weight of that possibility settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Watson found himself contemplating the implications of a world where humanity was not the only intelligence capable of complex strategic thought. The idea was simultaneously thrilling and terrifying, opening possibilities for discovery and understanding, while also suggesting dangers that human civilization was unprepared to face. "What do you recommend?" Watson asked. "How should we approach tonight's expedition in light of what you have shared with us?" Professor Blackwood leaned back in his chair, his weathered hands folded on the desk before him. "Approach with respect, gentlemen. If you do encounter one of these creatures, remember that you may be participating in a moment of first contact between two intelligent species. Your actions could influence the course of that relationship for generations to come." The afternoon was waning when Holmes and Watson finally left the Royal Maritime Museum, their minds filled with possibilities and implications that extended far beyond their original investigation. The fog had lifted somewhat, revealing glimpses of London's familiar streets, while maintaining an atmosphere of mystery that seemed appropriate to their extraordinary circumstances. As they made their way back toward Baker Street, Watson found himself observing the city with new eyes. The Thames flowed through London's heart like a great artery, connecting the present moment to depths of history that suddenly seemed far more complex and mysterious than he had ever imagined. Somewhere beneath those dark waters, ancient intelligences might be watching, waiting, making decisions that could shape the future of human civilization. Holmes walked beside him in contemplative silence, the detective's sharp mind clearly engaged with the strategic challenges that lay ahead. Their evening expedition had taken on new dimensions of significance, transformed from a simple investigation into a potential encounter with forms of life that had existed in secret since before the foundations of London were laid. The gas lamps were beginning to flicker to life as evening approached, casting their familiar golden glow across the fog-drifted streets. Soon, Watson reflected, they would return to those dark waters where mysteries older than human memory waited to be revealed. The prospect filled him with a mixture of excitement and trepidation that reminded him of his younger days, when the world had seemed full of undiscovered possibilities and every horizon had promised new adventures. As they approached their familiar lodgings at Baker Street, both men found their thoughts drawn inexorably toward the evening that lay ahead, and toward the possibility that their understanding of the world was about to be changed forever. The evening mist began to rise from the Thames just as the sun disappeared behind London's smoky horizon, creating an atmosphere that seemed perfectly suited to mysterious encounters and ancient revelations. Holmes and Watson made their final preparations in the golden glow of their sitting room, checking equipment and reviewing plans with the methodical care that years of partnership had taught them to bring to any potentially dangerous enterprise. Holmes had assembled an impressive array of tools for their expedition: waterproof cameras, underwater illumination devices, specimen containers, and various instruments for measuring and recording environmental conditions. His movements were precise and deliberate as he packed each item, the detective's mind clearly focused on the challenges that might await them on the dark waters of the Thames. Watson prepared his medical supplies with equal care, including materials for treating injuries that might result from encounters with unknown creatures, as well as equipment for analysing any biological samples they might be able to collect. His military experience had taught him the value of thorough preparation, and he was determined to be ready for any contingencies their investigation might reveal. "Captain Morrison will meet us at Westminster Pier in 1 hour, Holmes said, checking his pocket watch in the lamplight. He has arranged for a patrol boat equipped with searchlights and diving apparatus. should either prove necessary during our investigation. The prospect of venturing onto the Thames at night, armed with scientific equipment and accompanied by experienced river police, should have been reassuring. Yet Watson found himself experiencing the same mixture of excitement and apprehension that had marked the beginning of their most challenging cases. There was something about this particular mystery that seemed to promise discoveries far beyond the scope of their usual criminal investigations. Holmes moved to the window, gazing out at the fog-shrouded street below, where gas lamps created islands of warm light in the gathering darkness. His angular profile was sharp against the gentle illumination of their sitting room, and Watson could see that the detective's mind was already engaged with the evening's possibilities. "Watson," Holmes said softly, his voice carrying a note of unusual seriousness, "I feel I should warn you that tonight's expedition may expose us to phenomena that lie well beyond our previous experience. Professor Blackwood's research suggests that we may be dealing with intelligences that have remained hidden from human observation for extraordinary periods of time." Watson joined his friend at the window, the two of them standing side by side as they had so many times before, preparing to venture into unknown territory in pursuit of truth. The street below was quiet in the evening mist, with only occasional pedestrians hurrying past like shadows in the amber glow of the street lamps. "I understand," Watson replied, "though I confess that the prospect of such an encounter fills me with as much excitement as trepidation. The possibility of discovering forms of life that have existed in secret for centuries is both thrilling and humbling." Holmes smiled, and for a moment his expression held something of the enthusiasm that had marked their early adventures together, when the world had seemed full of mysteries waiting to be solved through the application of logic and careful observation. "Whatever we encounter tonight," Holmes said, "I believe we will remember this evening as marking a significant moment in human understanding of the natural world. We may be about to witness the emergence of secrets that have remained hidden since before the beginning of recorded history." The clock in the hallway chimed 8 times, marking the appointed hour for their departure. Holmes collected his equipment with practiced efficiency, while Watson gathered his medical supplies and the various instruments they might need for documenting their discoveries. Mrs. Hudson wished them well from the doorway, though her expression suggested that she found their evening plans somewhat more mysterious than their usual investigations. The journey to Westminster Pier through the fog-shrouded streets of London took on the quality of a passage between worlds. The familiar city had been transformed by the evening mist into something ancient and otherworldly, where gas lamps floated like distant stars in a grey void, and the sounds of normal urban activity were muffled to whispers that seemed to come from another realm entirely. Captain Morrison was waiting for them at the pier, a sturdy man of middle years whose weathered face spoke of decades spent patrolling London's waterways. He greeted them with professional courtesy, tinged with the wariness of someone who had agreed to participate in an investigation that challenged his understanding of the possible. "Good evening, gentlemen," Captain Morrison said, his voice carrying the authority of long experience with the Thames and its moods. "I have the patrol boat ready and fully equipped as requested, though I must confess the conditions tonight are rather more atmospheric than I would prefer for this sort of work." The fog had indeed grown thicker as evening progressed, transforming the Thames into an invisible presence that could be heard and sensed but not seen. The dark water lapped against the pier with gentle regularity, while the fog swirled above its surface in patterns that suggested movement just beyond the range of perception. Holmes thanked Captain Morrison for his assistance and began transferring their equipment to the patrol boat, a sturdy vessel equipped with powerful searchlights and various instruments for navigation and communication. The boat rocked gently at its moorings, and Watson could hear the quiet rumble of the engine as the captain prepared for their departure into the fog-shrouded night. "Where would you gentlemen like to begin our search?" Captain Morrison asked as they settled into the boat and prepared to cast off from the pier. Holmes consulted a chart he'd prepared earlier, marking the locations of the recent incidents with careful precision. "I suggest we begin with the area near London Bridge, where Catherine Marie encountered difficulties 3 nights ago. From there, we can proceed downstream toward the sites of the subsequent incidents." Captain Morrison nodded and guided the boat away from the pier, the engine settling into a steady rhythm as they moved into the fog-shrouded river. The searchlights cut through the mist like swords of white fire, revealing brief glimpses of the water's surface, while leaving everything beyond their immediate vicinity wrapped in grey mystery. The Thames at night, hidden beneath its blanket of fog, possessed a quality that Watson had never experienced during daylight navigation. The familiar landmarks of London were invisible, suggested only by the occasional glow of gas lamps that penetrated the mist, or the distant sound of activity from the unseen shores. They seemed to be travelling through a world that existed between the familiar reality of Victorian London and something far more ancient and mysterious. Holmes stood near the bow of the boat, his sharp eyes scanning the fog-obscured water for any signs of unusual activity. The detectives' equipment was arranged within easy reach, ready to document whatever phenomena they might encounter during their investigation. "The fog is actually working to our advantage," Holmes observed, his voice carrying clearly in the muffled atmosphere. "Many deep water species are more active during periods of reduced visibility, and our mysterious visitor may be more likely to reveal itself under these conditions." Captain Morrison guided the boat with expert precision through the invisible waterway, his long experience with the Thames allowing him to navigate safely despite the challenging conditions. The steady rumble of the engine and the gentle splash of water against the hull created a hypnotic rhythm that seemed to lull the fog-shrouded city into deeper slumber. As they approached the area where the Catherine Marie had been found, Holmes signalled for Captain Morrison to reduce speed and begin a systematic search pattern. The searchlight swept the water surface in broad arcs, revealing glimpses of the Thames that sparkled briefly before disappearing once more into the grey void. Watson found himself straining his senses for any indication of unusual activity, his medical training having taught him to observe subtle changes in environment and behaviour that might signal the presence of something significant. The fog seemed to muffle not only sound but all sensory input, creating an atmosphere of heightened anticipation where every shadow might conceal revelations. "There," Holmes said suddenly, his voice sharp with excitement. "Captain Morrison, if you would direct the searchlight toward the starboard bow." The bright beam swung toward the indicated area, illuminating a section of water that showed clear signs of disturbance. The surface was agitated in a circular pattern, perhaps 30 feet in diameter, with gentle swells radiating outward from a central point that suggested something large moving beneath the fog-obscured depths. Watson felt his pulse quicken as he observed the phenomenon. The disturbance was too organised to be explained by debris or normal river currents, and there was something about the pattern that suggested purposeful movement rather than random agitation. "Can you maintain our position here?" Holmes asked Captain Morrison, his hands already busy with the camera equipment he had brought for documenting their discoveries. The captain adjusted the boat's engine and steering to hold their position relative to the disturbance, while Holmes worked quickly to photograph the phenomenon from multiple angles. The camera flashes created brief, stark illuminations that revealed details lost in the steadier glow of the searchlights. "Watson," Holmes called softly, "you might want to prepare your specimen collection equipment. I believe we may shortly have opportunities to gather physical evidence." Watson opened his medical bag and retrieved the containers and instruments he had prepared for collecting samples, his hands steady despite the excitement that was building in his chest. The possibility of obtaining actual physical evidence of whatever was creating these disturbances was both thrilling and slightly overwhelming. The water disturbance seemed to be growing larger, the circular pattern expanding until it encompassed an area perhaps 50 feet in diameter. The gentle swells continued to radiate outward from the centre, and occasionally Watson thought he glimpsed something dark and substantial moving just beneath the surface. "Gentlemen," Captain Morrison said, his voice carrying a note of professional caution, "I'm seeing readings on my depth instruments that don't match the known characteristics of this section of the river." Holmes looked up from his camera work, his grey eyes bright with interest. "What sort of readings?" "The sounder is detecting something large and solid moving approximately 20 feet beneath our keel," the captain replied, his weathered hands steady on the boat's controls despite the unusual nature of his report. something considerably larger than any known species of fish that inhabits these waters. The implication sent a thrill of excitement through Watson's frame. The idea that their mysterious visitor was actually present, moving beneath their boat at that very moment, transformed their investigation from theoretical pursuit into immediate reality. Holmes moved to examine the depth-finding equipment. His analytical mind immediately engaged with the technical data that Captain Morrison's instruments were providing. The detective's ability to extract meaning from diverse sources of information was one of his most remarkable talents, and Watson could see that he was already formulating theories based on what the sounder was revealing. "The object appears to be moving in a deliberate pattern," Holmes observed, studying the instrument readings carefully. "Not the random movement one would expect from a large fish, but something that suggests conscious navigation and exploration." As if in response to Holmes's words, the water disturbance began to change character. The gentle swells gave way to more pronounced agitation, and suddenly a section of the Thames erupted in a fountain of spray that caught the searchlight and sparkled like liquid diamonds in the fog-shrouded night. Watson gripped the boat's railing as the vessel rocked in response to the water displacement, his eyes fixed on the area where something vast and dark was rising from the depths of the river. The fog swirled around the emerging form, creating an atmosphere of mystery and revelation that seemed perfectly suited to what was clearly a moment of extraordinary discovery. "My God," Captain Morrison breathed, his voice barely audible above the sound of disturbed water and the boat's engine. "In 30 years on this river, I have never seen anything like this." Holmes worked frantically with his camera equipment, capturing image after image as the creature continued to emerge from the Thames. The detective's movements were precise and deliberate despite the excitement of the moment, his scientific training allowing him to document the encounter, even as his mind struggled to process the implications of what they were witnessing. Watson found himself face to face with something that challenged every assumption he had ever made about the natural world. The creature that was rising from the fog-shrouded Thames was magnificent and alien in equal measure, possessed of a grace and intelligence that spoke of evolutionary pathways far different from anything in human experience. The tentacles that emerged first from the water were indeed massive, each one easily 2 feet in diameter and glistening with moisture that caught the searchlight in patterns of silver and deep purple. They moved with fluid grace, exploring the air above the water's surface with what appeared to be curious delicacy rather than aggressive intent. Watson watched in fascination as more of the creature revealed itself, each new detail adding to the sense that they were witnessing something both ancient and utterly alien to human experience. The skin of the tentacles showed complex patterns of coloration that shifted and changed in the searchlight, creating displays that seemed almost hypnotic in their beauty and complexity. "It's magnificent," Watson whispered, his voice filled with wonder rather than fear. The creature's movements were so graceful, so clearly purposeful, that it was impossible to view it as merely an animal. There was intelligence in every gesture, consciousness behind every exploration of the strange new environment it had entered. Holmes continued his careful documentation, his camera capturing image after image, while his keen eyes observed details that would be crucial for later analysis. The detective's scientific training was evident in his methodical approach, even as his natural curiosity was clearly captivated by what they were witnessing. More of the creature emerged from the fog-shrouded depths, revealing a body of extraordinary size and complexity. Watson estimated that the visible portion alone was perhaps 40 feet in length, though much of the creature remained hidden beneath the dark waters of the Thames. The skin showed the same shifting patterns of coloration as the tentacles, creating displays of purple, silver and deep blue that seemed to pulse with their own internal rhythm. "Captain Morrison," Holmes said quietly, his voice steady despite the extraordinary nature of their situation, "can you maintain our position without approaching closer? I believe our visitor may be as curious about us as we are about it." The experienced river captain nodded, his weathered hands steady on the boat's controls despite the unprecedented nature of what they were observing. "I, Mr. Holmes, will hold position and let it make the first moves." The creature seemed to sense their presence, several of its massive tentacles turning toward the boat with movements that were clearly investigative rather than threatening. Watson could see what appeared to be sensory organs along the length of each appendage, complex structures that were probably analysing their scent, their movement, perhaps even the vibrations of their engine and their voices. One of the tentacles approached the boat slowly, moving through the fog-laden air with extraordinary precision. Watson found himself holding his breath as the massive appendage came within arm's reach of their vessel, close enough that he could observe the intricate details of its surface structure and the complex patterns of coloration that continued to shift and flow like living art. "Remarkable," Holmes murmured, his voice filled with scientific excitement. "The creature appears to be using chromatophore cells similar to those found in cephalopods, but on a scale that suggests evolutionary adaptations far beyond anything previously documented." The tentacle hovered near the boat's railing for several moments, clearly studying the strange vessel and its occupants with what appeared to be genuine curiosity. Watson could sense intelligence behind the exploration, consciousness that was trying to understand what manner of beings they might be, and what their presence in its domain might signify. Then, as gently as it had approached, the tentacle withdrew, followed by the others in a graceful sequence that spoke of perfect coordination and control. The creature began to submerge once more, its massive form disappearing beneath the fog-shrouded surface with barely a ripple to mark its passage. "Wait," Watson called softly, though he was not sure what he hoped to accomplish. There was something about the creature's departure that felt premature, as if important communications had been left unfinished. Holmes lowered his camera and moved to the boat's railing, his grey eyes scanning the water where the creature had vanished. "I believe it will return," he said quietly. The encounter felt more like an initial investigation than a final departure. It was learning about us, just as we were learning about it. Captain Morrison adjusted the boat's position slightly, keeping their searchlights trained on the area where the creature had disappeared while maintaining the respectful distance that Holmes had requested. The fog continued to swirl around them, creating an atmosphere that seemed perfectly suited to encounters between different forms of intelligence. Watson found himself reviewing every detail of what they had witnessed, his medical training helping him catalogue the creature's physical characteristics while his imagination struggled to comprehend the implications of its obvious intelligence and awareness. They had clearly been observed and evaluated, subjected to careful study by something that possessed cognitive abilities that might rival or exceed human intelligence. "Holmes," Watson said softly, "did you notice the way it approached us?" There was nothing random or instinctive about its movements. Every gesture seemed calculated to gather information while avoiding any action that might be interpreted as threatening. The detective nodded, his sharp mind clearly engaged with the same observations. "Indeed, Watson, we have just participated in what may have been first contact between human beings and an intelligence that has remained hidden for extraordinary periods of time. The creature's behaviour suggests not only consciousness, but sophisticated social awareness." The implications were staggering. Watson tried to imagine what it might mean for humanity to share the world with intelligences that had existed in secret for centuries or millennia, watching human civilization develop while remaining carefully concealed in the depths of the Earth's waterways. "If Professor Blackwood's research is accurate," Holmes continued, "this creature may be part of a network of intelligences that spans continents, perhaps even global in scope. We may have just encountered a representative of a civilization that predates human history by vast periods of time." The water began to show signs of disturbance once more, gentle swells that suggested the creature's return to the area near their boat. This time, however, the emergence was different, more deliberate, more clearly structured as a conscious decision to reveal itself, rather than a simple investigation of the strange visitors to its domain. The creature rose from the depths with movements that seemed almost ceremonial in their precision and grace. More of its body became visible this time, revealing the extraordinary complexity of its form and the sophisticated control it exercised over its massive bulk. Watson estimated that they were seeing perhaps half of the creature's total size, and even that partial revelation was breathtaking in its implications. "It's beautiful," Watson whispered. And indeed there was something magnificent about the creature's presence that transcended simple scientific interest. The patterns of coloration that flowed across its skin, the perfect coordination of its movements, the obvious intelligence behind every gesture, all combined to create an impression of something that was both alien and deeply, mysteriously familiar. Holmes had resumed his documentation, but Watson could see that the detective was as moved by the creature's beauty as by its scientific significance. There was something about the encounter that reached beyond rational analysis into realms of wonder and recognition that touched the very foundations of human consciousness. The creature remained at the surface longer this time, allowing them extended observation while it continued its own careful study of their boat and its occupants. Several tentacles moved through the fog-laden air with exploratory precision, while others remained beneath the water's surface, presumably maintaining the creature's stability and position. Watson found himself trying to communicate across the vast gulf that separated their species, raising his hand in a gesture of greeting that he hoped might be interpreted as peaceful recognition rather than threat. To his amazement, one of the creature's tentacles responded with a movement that seemed almost like a mirror of his gesture, a graceful acknowledgement that sent thrills of excitement through his entire being. "Did you see that?" Watson asked breathlessly. "It responded to my greeting. It recognized the communicative intent behind the gesture." Holmes had observed the exchange as well, and his expression showed the same excitement that Watson was feeling. "We are clearly dealing with intelligence of a high order," the detective said. "The creature is not merely investigating us as strange objects in its environment. It is attempting to establish some form of communication protocol." The implications of that possibility were staggering. Watson imagined conversations that might bridge the enormous evolutionary gap between species, exchanges of knowledge that could revolutionize human understanding of life on Earth and perhaps beyond. They were potentially witnessing the first tentative steps toward communication between humanity and intelligences that had remained hidden since before the beginning of recorded history. The creature maintained its position near their boat for several more minutes, during which time both Holmes and Watson attempted various simple gestures and movements designed to convey peaceful intent and curiosity. Each attempt seemed to evoke some response from the creature, subtle movements or changes in coloration that suggested awareness of their communicative efforts. Then, as smoothly as it had emerged, the creature began to withdraw once more into the depths of the Thames. This departure felt different from the first, more final perhaps, but also more complete in some indefinable way. Watson had the sense that important information had been exchanged, even if they could not yet interpret its full significance. "Will we see it again?" Watson asked as the last traces of the creature disappeared beneath the fog-shrouded surface. Holmes was quiet for a moment, his analytical mind clearly processing everything they had witnessed while attempting to predict future developments. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of confident anticipation. "I believe tonight was merely the beginning," he said. "We have established contact, demonstrated peaceful intent, and shown our willingness to approach this relationship with respect rather than aggression. The creature will return, and when it does, I suspect it will bring others of its kind." Captain Morrison had remained silent throughout most of the encounter, his experienced eyes taking in details that his long familiarity with the Thames allowed him to interpret in ways that might not be apparent to land-based observers. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of professional assessment mixed with personal wonder. "In all my years patrolling these waters," he said slowly, "I have never seen anything that approached what we witnessed tonight. But I can tell you this. That creature has been living in the Thames for far longer than any of us realized. Some of the stories the old-timers tell, the tales that we always dismissed as the products of too much gin and too little sleep, I believe we may need to reconsider those stories in light of what we've seen." The journey back to Westminster Pier passed in contemplative silence, each member of their small expedition lost in thoughts about the extraordinary encounter they had shared. The fog continued to shroud London in its grey embrace, but somehow the city seemed changed by what they had experienced on its ancient river. Watson found himself looking at the familiar landmarks with new eyes, seeing not just the Victorian metropolis that was the pride of the British Empire, but an older, deeper reality where ancient intelligences had watched human civilization develop from hidden vantage points beneath the dark waters that flowed through the heart of the growing city. Holmes sat quietly in the bow of the boat, his hands steady on the camera equipment while his mind clearly worked to integrate their discoveries into frameworks of understanding that could encompass both scientific rationality and the profound mystery they had encountered. Watson knew that the detective would spend days, perhaps weeks, analysing every detail of their experience and planning follow-up investigations that might deepen their understanding of what they had witnessed. As they approached Westminster Pier, the familiar glow of gas lamps created pools of warm light that seemed to welcome them back to the ordinary world of human activity and everyday concerns. Yet Watson knew that neither he nor Holmes would ever again be able to look at the Thames without remembering the magnificent intelligence that dwelt beneath its surface, watching, waiting, perhaps preparing for revelations that would change the course of human history. The fog began to lift slightly as they secured the boat and gathered their equipment, revealing glimpses of London's skyline that seemed both familiar and subtly transformed by their experience. They had ventured into the unknown and returned with evidence of wonders that challenged every assumption about humanity's place in the natural order. "What do we do now?" Watson asked as they prepared to return to the comfortable warmth of Baker Street and the familiar routine of their shared lodgings. Holmes paused in his packing, his grey eyes reflecting the distant glow of the street lamps as he considered their options. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet confidence that had guided them through so many previous investigations. "Now we prepare for what comes next," he said simply. "Tonight was my first contact, Watson. The real work begins tomorrow." The journey back to Baker Street through the fog-lifted streets of London gave both men time to reflect on the extraordinary events of the evening. The familiar sounds of the city, the clip-clop of horse hooves on cobblestones, the distant voices of late-night pedestrians, the gentle hiss of gas lamps, all seemed somehow different after their encounter with intelligence that might predate human civilization by uncounted millennia. Watson found himself looking up at the windows they passed, wondering how many of London's residents were aware that ancient minds were stirring beneath the waters that flowed through their city's heart. The comfortable assumptions of Victorian society, the certainty that humanity represented the pinnacle of earthly intelligence, the belief that the natural world had been thoroughly catalogued and understood, all seemed suddenly fragile in the face of what they had witnessed. Holmes walked beside him in contemplative silence, the detective's analytical mind clearly working to process the implications of their discoveries while planning the investigations that would surely follow. Watson knew that his friend's approach to this mystery would be characteristically methodical, building understanding step by step through careful observation and logical analysis. When they finally reached their familiar lodgings, the warm glow of their sitting room seemed like a sanctuary from the profound mysteries they had encountered on the fog-shrouded Thames. Mrs. Hudson had left tea service ready for their return, and the familiar comfort of their domestic routine provided a reassuring anchor to the everyday world even as their thoughts remained focused on the extraordinary. Holmes moved immediately to his desk, where he began the careful process of organising the photographic plates and notes from their expedition. His movements were precise and methodical, the detective's trained mind already beginning the systematic analysis that would extract every possible insight from their encounter. Watson settled into his chair by the fire, grateful for the warmth and familiar surroundings while his mind continued to replay every detail of their remarkable experience. The creature's grace, its obvious intelligence, the way it had responded to his attempt at communication. All of these memories seemed both vivid and dreamlike, as if they belonged to some other realm of experience entirely. "Holmes," Watson said softly, "do you believe we witnessed something that will change everything? Not just our understanding of the natural world, but humanity's entire conception of its place in the order of things." The detective paused in his work, his hands still on the photographic materials while his grey eyes reflected the dancing flames in the fireplace. When he spoke, His voice carried the weight of careful consideration, mixed with the excitement of genuine discovery. "I believe, my dear Watson, that we have participated in a moment that will be remembered as marking a fundamental shift in human consciousness. We have encountered intelligence that exists outside the familiar categories of scientific classification, consciousness that operates according to principles we are only beginning to glimpse." Holmes returned to his organisational work, but Watson could see that his friend's thoughts remained focused on the broader implications of their discoveries. The detective's ability to see patterns and connections that others missed would be crucial in developing an understanding of what their encounter might mean for the future of human knowledge. "The creature's behaviour suggests not only individual intelligence but social awareness," Holmes continued, his voice taking on the measured cadence he used when working through complex analytical problems. "Its careful approach, its obvious evaluation of our intentions, its willingness to engage in what appeared to be rudimentary communication, all of these factors suggest that we may be dealing with representatives of a civilization that has its own protocols for contact between species." The implications were staggering. Watson tried to imagine social structures and cultural patterns that had developed over periods of time that dwarfed human history, intelligence that might have observed the rise and fall of empires while remaining carefully hidden in domains that humanity had never suspected of harbouring conscious life. "If such a civilization exists," Watson said, "then our encounter tonight may have been as significant for them as it was for us. They have revealed themselves to human observation for the first time, taking the risk of making contact with a species whose intentions and capabilities are largely unknown to them." Holmes nodded, his sharp mind clearly engaged with the same line of reasoning. "Indeed, Watson, we may have witnessed an act of considerable courage on their part, a decision to step beyond the concealment that has protected them for centuries in order to establish some form of relationship with humanity." The weight of that responsibility settled over both men like a heavy blanket. They had become, quite by accident, ambassadors for their entire species in what might prove to be one of the most important relationships in human history. Their actions, their approach to future encounters, their ability to convey peaceful intent and genuine respect, all of these factors might influence the course of contact between humanity and intelligences whose existence had been unsuspected until this evening. Holmes completed his organisation of their materials and moved to join Watson by the fire, settling into his familiar chair with the comfortable ease of long habit. The detective's expression showed the satisfaction of someone who had successfully documented extraordinary phenomena mixed with the anticipation of someone who understood that their investigation had only just begun. "Tomorrow," Holmes said, reaching for his pipe with the slow deliberation that marked his periods of deepest concentration, "we will begin the process of analysing what we have learned and planning our next steps. Professor Blackwood's expertise will be invaluable in helping us understand the historical context of our encounter, while Captain Morrison's knowledge of the Thames will guide our future expeditions." Watson felt a thrill of excitement at the prospect of continued investigation. The evening's encounter had opened doorways to possibilities that challenged his understanding of the world, and he was eager to step through those doorways into whatever revelations might wait beyond. "Do you believe they will return?" Watson asked. "Will we have opportunities to deepen this initial contact?" Holmes drew slowly on his pipe, the tobacco glowing like a tiny star in the warm light of their sitting room. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet confidence that had guided them through so many previous adventures. "I am certain of it, Watson. We have established peaceful contact, demonstrated our willingness to approach this relationship with respect and curiosity, rather than fear or aggression. They will return, and when they do, I believe we will find that tonight's encounter was merely the beginning of discoveries that will transform our understanding of life on Earth." The fire settled lower in the grate as the evening progressed toward night, casting warm shadows that danced across the familiar walls of their shared lodgings. Outside, London had settled into its nightly rhythm, the great city breathing slowly as it prepared for sleep, unaware that ancient mysteries had stirred beneath its waters, and that the future might hold revelations beyond the scope of human imagination. Watson found himself looking forward to sleep, eager to see what dreams might come to process the extraordinary experiences of the evening. Yet he was equally anticipatory about the dawn that would bring new opportunities for investigation and understanding, new chances to explore the boundaries between the known and unknown that had been revealed beside the fog-shrouded Thames. Holmes continued to smoke his pipe in contemplative silence, his sharp mind clearly engaged with plans and possibilities that would guide their future investigations. The detective's ability to extract maximum insight from limited evidence would be crucial in developing their understanding of what they had encountered and what it might mean for the future of human knowledge. As the clock in the hallway chimed midnight, both men found their thoughts turning toward rest and the dreams that might help them process the profound experiences they had shared. They had ventured into the unknown and returned with evidence of wonders that challenged every comfortable assumption about humanity's place in the natural order. The fog had lifted completely by now, revealing London's familiar skyline through their sitting-room windows. Yet somehow the city seemed changed by what they had experienced, transformed by the knowledge that ancient intelligences dwelt beneath its waters, watching, waiting, perhaps preparing for revelations that would reshape the future of both species. Watson rose from his chair and moved to the window, gazing out at the gas-lit streets where ordinary life continued its familiar patterns while extraordinary mysteries stirred just beyond the edges of perception. The Thames flowed on toward the sea, carrying with it secrets that were only beginning to be revealed, promises of discoveries that might transform human understanding of life itself. "Holmes," Watson said softly, "I find myself thinking that we may have participated tonight in one of the most important moments in human history, the beginning of contact with intelligence that has remained hidden since before the foundations of civilization were laid." The detective joined his friend at the window, the two of them standing side by side as they had so many times before, contemplating mysteries that lay at the very foundations of human understanding. The street below was quiet in the late-night stillness, with only occasional pedestrians hurrying past toward the warmth and safety of home. "Indeed, Watson," Holmes replied, his voice carrying the quiet satisfaction of someone who had successfully navigated uncharted territory. "We have opened a door that can never be closed again, initiated a relationship that may prove to be among the most significant in the history of either species." The prospect filled Watson with a mixture of excitement and profound responsibility. They had become, quite by chance, the first human beings to establish contact with intelligence that might predate their own species by vast periods of time. The future would bring challenges and opportunities that neither man could fully anticipate, but Watson was confident that their approach, based on respect, curiosity, and genuine desire for understanding, would serve them well in whatever revelations lay ahead. As they prepared to retire for the evening, both men found their thoughts turning toward the peaceful waters of sleep and the dreams that might help them integrate the extraordinary experiences they had shared. They had ventured beyond the comfortable boundaries of Victorian scientific understanding and returned with evidence of wonders that challenged every assumption about the nature of intelligence and consciousness on Earth. The Thames flowed on through the heart of London, carrying ancient secrets toward the sea, while new possibilities for understanding and communication stirred in its hidden depths. Somewhere beneath those dark waters, magnificent intelligences were perhaps contemplating their own first encounter with humanity, making their own plans for the future of a relationship that had begun with careful curiosity and mutual respect. Watson settled into the comfort of his bed with a sense of completion that reminded him of the satisfaction that followed successful medical procedures or well-conducted military campaigns. They had achieved something significant, accomplished something that would be remembered long after they themselves had passed from the world. The future would bring new challenges and revelations, but tonight they could rest in the knowledge that they had taken the first crucial steps toward understanding mysteries that had waited centuries to be revealed. Holmes remained at his desk for several minutes longer, making final notes about the evening's discoveries and sketching preliminary plans for future investigations. The detective's methodical approach to extraordinary phenomena would be crucial in developing their understanding of what they had encountered and what it might mean for the future of human knowledge. As London settled into the deep quiet of late night, Both men found themselves drifting towards sleep, with minds full of possibilities and dreams touched by wonder. They had encountered intelligence that existed beyond the familiar categories of scientific understanding, consciousness that operated according to principles they were only beginning to glimpse. The fog had lifted completely now, revealing the stars that sparkled above the great city like distant promises of discoveries yet to be made. Somewhere in those celestial depths, other intelligences might be watching, waiting, preparing for revelations that would connect Earth to the larger community of conscious beings that might inhabit the cosmos. Watson's last conscious thoughts were of the magnificent creature they had encountered, its grace and obvious intelligence, the way it had responded to his simple gesture of greeting with what had seemed like recognition and peaceful acknowledgement. They had established contact across one of the greatest gulfs imaginable, the evolutionary distance between species that had developed along completely different pathways toward consciousness and understanding. Holmes fell asleep at his desk, his head resting on his arms while his hands remained near the photographic plates that documented their extraordinary encounter. The detective's dreams were filled with patterns and connections, analytical frameworks that might help him understand the implications of what they had witnessed and what it might mean for the future of human civilization. Outside their windows, London breathed slowly in its sleep, the great city unaware that ancient mysteries had stirred beneath its waters, and that the future might hold revelations beyond the scope of human imagination. The Thames flowed on toward the sea, carrying secrets that were only beginning to be revealed, promises of understanding that might transform the relationship between humanity and the natural world. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, marking the passage of time while consciousness explored new boundaries of possibility and understanding. In the depths below and the heights above, intelligence stirred and prepared for revelations that would connect all conscious beings in webs of relationship and understanding that stretched beyond the imagination of any single species. And in the comfortable warmth of their Baker Street lodgings, two friends rested in the satisfaction of having taken the first steps toward discoveries that would be remembered long after the fog-shrouded evening that had brought them face to face with wonders beyond the scope of ordinary human experience. They had ventured into the unknown and returned with evidence of intelligence that challenged every assumption about consciousness and its many forms throughout the cosmos. The night settled deeper over London, bringing dreams touched by mystery and promise, while ancient intelligences stirred in hidden depths and prepared for revelations that would transform the understanding of all conscious beings fortunate enough to participate in the great adventure of existence itself. That's our story tonight. Are you drifting off in the quiet rain of Melbourne, beneath the glowing skyline of Dubai, the candlelit stillness of Prague, or the breeze-kissed coast of Havana? If this tale brought you calm, like the episode and subscribe for more nights like this. Let the silence hold you. Let your dreams wander. Sleep gently now, wherever you are in this wide and wondrous world.